1932. An expedition climbed into Tibet and never returned. In the spring of 1932, a small European expedition set out across the Tibetan Plateau, that high and desolate land the locals call the roof of the world. Their mission was part science, part ambition, geologists, climbers, and a photographer bound together by the dream of mapping valleys and measuring peaks no Westerner had yet set eyes upon. They carried crates of instruments, cameras, tents, and journals, but more importantly, a conviction that knowledge could tame even the highest wilderness. Their route wound through mountain passes, carved by centuries of wind and snow. Caravans of yaks bore their loads, bells clinking in the thin air. Local guides led the way, muttering prayers beneath breath, wary of the mountain's moods. The air grew thinner with each ascent. Frost formed on beards even beneath the midday sun. At night, fires flickered weakly against the immensity of sky, and the stars burned brighter than in any lowland dream. The men wrote eagerly in their diaries. One noted the crystalline silence that hung over the peaks. Another described colored lights dancing across the ridges at dusk, dismissing them as tricks of altitude. The photographer captured glaciers like walls of glass, valleys split by rivers the color of iron. To their eyes, the plateau was a frontier, but to their guides, it was a place already spoken for, haunted, sacred, and unforgiving. As they pushed deeper, clouds gathered over the summits, and winds rose sharp enough to flay skin. Yet the expedition pressed on, their journals filling with words that would soon become the only trace they left behind. They had entered a country where the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see who would endure and who would vanish into silence. The deeper the expedition pressed into Tibet, the more uneasy their guides became. Villagers in remote hamlets warned them not to linger in certain valleys where, they said, the mountains themselves resented intrusion. Strange cairns of stones stood along the path, markers of old rituals adorned with prayer flags snapping in the thin wind. To the scientists, they were curiosities. To the locals, they were warnings. One evening, as the sun bled out behind serrated ridges, the party camped near a frozen lake. The surface reflected the sky in unsettling shades of crimson and violet. That night, the photographer noted lights dancing above the water, pale bands that shimmered without sound. He dismissed them as aurora, though none had been reported so far south. In the morning, their guides refused to cross the lake, insisting the spirits of drowned travelers lay beneath the ice. The Europeans laughed, shouldered their packs, and pressed on without them. The higher they climbed, the more the signs multiplied. Compass needles spun erratically. Watches slowed, then raced. A diary entry spoke of low tones echoing across the valleys, like horns blown from the mountains themselves. Another recorded footprints in fresh snow, large, unshod, and vanishing into a ravine where no man had walked. Some of the party grew unsettled, yet pride and ambition pushed them forward. Their journals grew more fragmented, lines scribbled hastily, words unfinished. One page ended with, "We hear voices carried on the wind," the ink trailing where the pen had slipped, whether exhaustion, altitude sickness, or something stranger. The men were changing. The plateau, indifferent yet watchful, seemed to weigh heavier on every breath they drew. By early June of 1932, the expedition was last seen by a group of traders moving west along the plateau. The explorers waved from a ridge, their yaks trudging behind, before vanishing into the folds of the mountains. Days passed, then weeks, and no further word returned. When supply parties attempted to follow their route, they found only silence. The first sign came near a collapsed ridge of ice. A torn scrap of canvas, stiff with frost, flapped in the wind. Nearby lay a shattered crate, its contents, weather instruments, scattered across the snow. Yet no tracks marked the ground, as though the men had stepped into the air itself. Higher up, a campsite appeared frozen in time. Cooking pots blackened from fire, journals half filled, a camera set upon a tripod facing nothing. The tent ropes had been cut, not loosened, as if abandoned in haste. Most chilling were the diaries. Pages described worsening storms, disoriented compasses, and a growing sense that they were being watched. The last entries were jagged, words running into each other. Shadows move at night. We hear them outside the tent. They do not speak. After that, nothing. Searchers combed valleys and ridges, but the expedition had vanished as completely as breath in the thin air. No bodies, no bones, not even discarded gear beyond that single camp. Locals whispered that the mountains had claimed them whole, pulling them into caves or snowfields no outsider could find. Officials filed reports of death by exposure, yet such a death leaves remains. The plateau gave none. The explorers had stepped into Tibet's silence and never stepped out again. When the expedition failed to return, rumors spread faster than any official word. In Lhasa, traders spoke of strangers glimpsed on high passes, staggering as though lost, then vanishing into mist. A monk from a remote monastery claimed that 3 Europeans had approached, begging for shelter, only to disappear before dawn. In villages, shepherds told of strange lights drifting above ridges at night, moving too slowly for meteors, too silently for aircraft. In Europe, newspapers turned the mystery into spectacle. Headlines spoke of a vanished caravan on the roof of the world, while illustrations showed spectral figures wandering glaciers. Families of the missing pleaded for answers, receiving only silence or conflicting reports. Some claimed survivors had been taken captive, others that they had found forbidden valleys never meant for outsiders. Search parties dispatched from India and Nepal returned empty-handed. They found cairns toppled, frozen rivers stained with what looked like ash, but no footprints, no remains. One searcher swore he heard human cries carried on the wind during a storm, though no man was found when dawn broke. His report was dismissed as delirium. Officially, the case was closed. The men were declared dead, victims of exposure or avalanche. Yet the lack of evidence only fed the legend. Writers compared them to the Franklin expedition, swallowed whole by an unforgiving land. To others, their fate seemed tied not to nature, but to something stranger. Altitude itself, thinning the line between the living and the spectral. The expedition had set out to map uncharted valleys. Instead, they had become a map of their own, a blank space filled only with rumor, silence, and the echoes of a journey that ended nowhere. Long after the searchers departed, the camps they left behind were slowly consumed by snow. The wind erased footprints, buried broken crates, and carried away scraps of canvas. By winter's end, it was as though no man had ever passed. The Tibetan Plateau is merciless in this way. It does not hold on to evidence, only silence. Those who dared to linger spoke of an oppressive weight that hung over the valleys. Monks described it as the presence of spirits unsettled, guardians of sacred peaks offended by intrusion. Climbers called it something else, the crushing solitude of altitude, where every breath feels borrowed. Either way, the plateau seemed determined to guard its secret. Travelers in the years that followed sometimes stumbled upon strange relics: a rusted stove in a rock cleft, a notebook page half frozen into ice, a length of rope trailing into a crevasse. Each fragment hinted at survival, struggle, or desperation, but never a complete story. None of the explorers' bodies were ever recovered. The mountain held its silence, and the silence became a legend. To the families in Europe, letters returned unopened, pensions were paid, and officials closed the books. Yet the absence was heavier than proof. A death certificate could not erase the question: how can men vanish so utterly that even mountains leave no trace? The expedition had sought knowledge of peaks and passes. Instead, they became a warning etched into snow and stone. The higher they climbed, the thinner the air, until at last, the world above the clouds took them in and kept them. Years after the disappearance, travelers through the Tibetan Plateau still carried unsettling stories. Caravan drivers spoke of hearing voices echoing across valleys where no one walked. Some claimed the words were foreign, shouted against the wind, then cut short by silence. Mountaineers told of figures glimpsed at dusk, men in strange European coats, standing on ridges before fading like mirages. One tale spread from a Russian pilot who flew reconnaissance over the region. He reported seeing a line of tents pitched on a snowfield, neat and orderly, yet when a ground party arrived days later, nothing remained. Not a scrap, not a pole, not even depressions in the snow. To him, it was as if the mountain itself had conjured a phantom camp. Local monks explained these stories not as fantasy, but as warning. The plateau, they said, holds echoes of those who trespass too far. The lost do not always vanish. They sometimes remain as shadows, whispering reminders that the mountains are not for man to claim. Westerners, with their instruments and ambitions, had merely awakened something older. For the families of the vanished, such stories were unbearable and irresistible. Some clung to them as proof their loved ones still lingered in some form. Others dismissed them as cruelty born of rumor. Yet the reports multiplied until the expedition lived on, less as fact and more as apparition. Whispers of the heights carried the same refrain. The men were gone, but their voices had not left. The plateau had turned them into echoes, bound to the wind and the snow, forever circling the ridges they had tried to chart. By the mid-1930s, the story of the Vanished Expedition had drifted into legend. No bodies were ever recovered, no graves marked. The official records list them as lost to exposure, yet the absence of proof fed something larger than fact. Their diaries, ending mid-sentence, became relics, Their last campsite, a shrine. Each retelling grew more haunted, more uncertain, until the expedition existed less as men and more as myth. The Tibetan Plateau itself seemed to absorb their memory. Travelers spoke of sudden stillness when crossing the valleys where they were last seen. The wind dropped, birds fell silent, and even yaks balked at stepping forward. Locals left offerings at cairns, strips of cloth, whispered prayers, gestures of respect for those claimed by altitude. In Europe, the tale became another chapter in the catalogue of lost explorers. Franklin in the Arctic, Scott in Antarctica, and now nameless men in Tibet. But unlike frozen ships or abandoned huts, the plateau offered nothing tangible. It gave only silence, a silence that seemed to stretch as wide as the sky itself. To this day, the fate of the 1932 expedition is uncertain. Their path remains unmarked, their remains unrecovered, their story unfinished. Yet perhaps that is the essence of altitude. At such heights, men do not simply die. They vanish into thin air, becoming part of the landscape, part of the myth. On the roof of the world, where every breath is fragile, the expedition endures not as bones beneath stone, but as echoes carried by the wind, eternal, invisible, and unanswered.